Welcome to Breaking the Set. I'm Abby Martin. So this past weekend, tens of thousands of activists in countries around the world took to the streets to protest the continued Israeli aggression in the Gaza Strip. In Paris, demonstrators were met with tear gas and rubber bullets as they defied a recent ban on pro-Palestinian protests enacted by the French government. In Chile, 5,000 people surrounded the Israeli embassy and pasted photos of dead Gazan children to its walls. In South Africa, thousands marched in Cape Town and Durban, demanding that the government expel the Israeli ambassador in the wake of the country's ground invasion of Gaza that has left scores of civilians dead. And in the U.S., thousands of activists rallied from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco to condemn the ongoing siege and call for Obama to put an end to the $3+ billion in military aid this country gives Israel every year. So, as we continue to hear the horrific news coming out of Gaza, remember that perhaps nothing is more powerful than a global demonstration of solidarity, because the stronger and louder our voices get, eventually our leaders will have no choice but to listen. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
Once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do, because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire was told. These words are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in, cause we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
With so many global conflicts unfolding around the world, the growing unrest in Iraq has largely been backpaged, which could have something to do with the perception that America's involvement in the country is over. Well, in fact, it's still playing a military role in perpetuating the chaos. In fact, more than 5,500 Iraqi civilians have been killed in the first 6 months of this year alone, according to the UN. Additionally, another 1.2 million have been displaced by the violence. So how did it get to this point? This unraveling is the subject of a recent article by journalist Dar Jamal, staff reporter with truthout.org, and one of the very few unembedded journalists to have reported from the ground in Iraq during the U.S. invasion in 2003. Well, earlier, Dar joined me, and I first asked him to break down exactly what events have taken place since the U.S. withdrawal that have led to Iraq becoming a near-failed state.
It really all started when Maliki took power, because since that time on, he has really been launching an organized, ongoing attack against the minority Sunni population. There's been reports on massive amounts of torture, detainees. Maliki's been sending government forces into primarily Sunni neighborhoods of Baghdad, as well as in towns like Fallujah, to detain Sunnis and holding them in secret prisons. A lot of this has come out over the years, many years since he's been in power. Human Rights Watch has done reports on it, as has Amnesty International, on his secret detention facilities around Baghdad. And this escalated to a point where, beginning in late 2012, Sunni populations in Anbar province, as well as parts of Baghdad and much of the rest of Iraq, every Friday started holding demonstrations against the government. They were peaceful demonstrations, but Maliki decided to start sending in the military and security forces and actually killing a lot of the protesters. And then that point where by the middle of last year, we had attacks against government forces start in these same Sunni areas. They weren't able to keep a lid on the resistance that was growing within the Sunni population. And so that escalated things to a point where we had a very large amount of the Sunni population that was completely politically disenfranchised, not getting their voice heard at all in Baghdad, and the persecutions from the Maliki regime continuing. And so we had a giant percentage of the population ripe and ready for armed resistance against the government, and then bring in a group like ISIS, who came in and started taking over towns and going against Maliki, and that's why we have a situation that looks the way it does today.
And in a recent article you just wrote for Truthout, really great article, you described daily life in Iraq during the height of the occupation as being a walk in the park compared to how violent the country is today. Paint that picture for our viewers of just an average Iraqi, what they deal with on a day-to-day basis.
There's a man whom I quote in the article who is a Sunni man who's married with 3 small children, living in the middle of Baghdad in a predominantly Sunni neighborhood. And I quote him at length in the article because his story is so telling of so many Sunnis now living as a minority population being persecuted by the Maliki regime in Baghdad. And he said that we literally can't go north, south, east, or west because there's fighting if we go north, east, or west, and if we can't go south because the area is completely controlled by Shia militias that are basically hunting Sunnis at this point. We have the Mahdi Army, the Badr Brigade, et cetera, other Shia militias that are literally going around trying to find Sunnis to kill. They've taken the orders of Grand Ayatollah Sistani, basically the Shia religious leader of the country, and are banding together, but instead of just fighting against ISIS, they're trying to find any Sunnis they can. So because of that, Sunnis living in Baghdad wanting to leave the country, trying to find safety for their families, can't go anywhere. And so he said, look, even if we try to get a bus ticket to get on a bus to take us to some other part of Iraq, let alone exiting Iraq altogether, you can't get a bus ticket because the prices are too expensive, and plus there's a two-month wait. So he's literally living a day at a time in fear, not knowing what is going to happen, not knowing if his home's going to be raided, not knowing the fate of his family, and literally there's really just nothing he can do. And of course, this is all exacerbated by the fact that if you're an Iraqi, trying to get a visa to go anywhere to leave the country is just about impossible.
It's truly horrific. It sounds just absolutely nightmarish. I wanted to talk to you about ISIS. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader. Talk about the aims of this group, how they've been able to accomplish so much, because I was speaking to Iraqi Dalia Wasfi, and she was saying that there's kind of this fear-mongering about ISIS, so that they're worse than al-Qaeda, almost trying to resurrect an offensive by the U.S. to combat them. However, on the other hand, they can't have gotten to where they are without the help of Iraqis on the ground.
Exactly, and I think if we talk about ISIS, we have to talk about the Syria component because of the U.S. and Qatar and Saudi Arabia funding and backing and arming these radical groups on the ground in Syria who are going against Bashar al-Assad. That is where ISIS has gained a lot of its strength. So in a sense, we also have a modern-day catch-22, where on the one hand, you have the U.S. dumping massive amounts of money, arms, and backing into rebel groups in Syria, and a whole lot of this, directly or indirectly, is going into ISIS. And then on the other hand, you've got the U.S. backing Maliki in Baghdad, to whom they've sold over $25 billion in counting of military training and weaponry. So the U.S. is literally pouring fuel into both sides of the conflict on a daily basis. But ISIS isn't as strong as it is without that direct and indirect U.S. support on the ground in Syria. So when they come into Iraq, where there's a very fertile Sunni population, extremely angry, completely politically disenfranchised, their leadership is not asking them to fight, but then you bring this radical group in who's taking the fight directly to any Shia they can find, particularly Maliki's forces in Baghdad. So that's why they've automatically had this grassroots support. So huge cities like Tal Afar, others like Fallujah, Ramadi, Samarra, and then all the smaller villages in between are just literally, they're being welcomed in because, hey, people are being attacked by the government. All of a sudden, here's this force coming in that's fighting back. So, of course, they're having popular support over broad swaths of the country.
Right, and earlier this month, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel said that the U.S. won't take part in fighting in Iraq, but Dart, we know that several hundred U.S. troops or special advisors or whatever you want to call them are already on the ground. U.S. has sent drones, missiles, arms. Is this a slippery slope for U.S. military involvement again?
Very much so. At last count that the Pentagon admits to, we have at least 750 soldiers there. They're saying that they're not going to take direct part in direct actions of conflict yet. They've already been slated to fly Apache attack helicopters that the U.S. already has sold to Baghdad. The Pentagon's already pushing for them to have more quote-unquote freedom and latitude to do what's necessary. So that you look at these things in addition to the amount of Hellfire missiles being rushed in, Obama going to Congress asking for more funding of the Maliki regime, all this together it is a very, very slippery slope, and we're only seeing these trends continue.
And like you just said, I mean, the hypocrisy is just even more astounding when you look at the funding of these Syria rebels and how it's flooding in and emboldening ISIS. And then here we are giving arms to the Maliki government to fight ISIS. It's just, I can't follow it because it's just so extraordinary. Between Iraq's Shiite parliament unable to govern, ISIS's takeovers of part of the country, and the Kurds calling for a referendum to form their own independent country. What hope of preserving Iraq is there, and what can we do to help Iraqis on the ground, Dar?
The country is literally in a state of disintegration. The Kurds are absolutely taking advantage of the instability to go autonomous. They've been planning this for years, and they're getting support for it. We have the U.S. building massive new CIA complexes and military establishments in Kurdistan, probably as a backup for Baghdad, which they might see a repeat of Saigon, the way things are going these days. So the country is disintegrating. What we can do, at least as journalists, is just keep reporting it accurately and honestly, which is certainly not what the U.S. government is doing, and not what much of the mainstream media is doing, and to keep giving the Iraqis a voice and reminding people that the U.S. is implicitly involved in this, and that the situation in Iraq is as hellish as it is today because it's directly the legacy of the U.S. invasion and occupation of that country.
Crucial story to bring into the light. Thank you for doing it. Dar Jamal, staff reporter, truthout.org, and author of Beyond the Green Zone. Really appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
Coming up, I'll have all the latest on the ground from Gaza. Stay tuned.
Are you like me? Do you want your comedy news with some teeth? Want your comedy news to be a bare-fisted, no-holds-barred fight to the death? Like a truth vampire biting into the necks of the corporate elite and the billionaire freaks while they're going, make it stop! Well, that's what you get with my new show, Redacted Tonight.
Was that too much? I think that's too much.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy, covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the Set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
This weekend saw the bloodiest days since the start of Israel's nearly 2-week-long assault on the Gaza Strip, dubbed Operation Protective Edge. On Saturday night, IDF forces crushed the residential neighborhood of Shai-Jaya, killing at least 60 people in just 1 hour. In fact, the shelling was so severe, ambulances couldn't even access the area to assist the dying and injured, left lying in the streets. Now, Israel's launched a media campaign justifying the atrocity, claiming that rockets were being kept below the village. And just this morning, the IDF bombed a hospital, killing 3 people and wounding 50 more. This wasn't the first time Israel specifically targeted a medical center since the siege began. The bloodshed has brought Gaza's death toll to at least 537 people killed at the time of this broadcast, according to Bloomberg, and 3,300 more injured, according to the International Middle East Media Center. The majority of the casualties are women and children. But it's not just the extreme disproportionality of the aggression. It's also Israel's use of controversial weaponry during the attack. Not only is the IDF using banned dime weapons against civilians that emit micro-shrapnel, according to The Guardian, the military is employing flechette shells too, which release thousands of potentially lethal metal darts into the air. In the past, the organization Human Rights Watch has pointed to the indiscriminate use of these weapons as evidence of war crimes. Well, to get the on-the-ground perspective, earlier I was joined by Suha Najjar, Palestinian resident who's been in Gaza City throughout Operation Protective Edge. I began by asking her how exactly Israel warns Palestinians of these imminent attacks and where they can go to flee the incoming violence.
Typically, there's different types of warnings. Some of them, they call them here Stawana, which is like CDs. So they're automated messages that you get on your phone. They'll consistently call. They'll call like every day. They're like, oh, you should leave your area. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to strike your home. They'll typically do an entire area. So my family, the majority of my family is from Jabalia, which is a refugee camp in the north, and it's under a lot of fire. So the entire area, all of Jabalia, all of Beit Lahey, like these entire villages, get these automated messages, but these people don't have anywhere to go. And then there's other types of warnings. Some of them are missiles. So they'll hit like a warning missile on the house. It's called knock on the door. And these missiles have killed dozens of Palestinians. And it typically gives them like a 1 minute to a 5 minute warning to leave their house. And those are the ones that people, those are the scary ones that I've seen right outside my house occur. And then there's others, sometimes they take over, they hack the news stations here, and they'll tell entire areas to leave. But the problem with those warnings is that there's actually nowhere to go in Gaza. All of Gaza is 139 square miles, and they've already told all the villages and cities near the borders to leave and come towards central Gaza, which is where I live now. But there's just so many people. They've already filled up basically there's no more room in the UN schools. These schools hold up to like 40,000 people. And I went and I visited one. There are people sleeping on the floor, people in the classrooms. There's just nowhere to go.
Right. I mean, the borders are closed, even though they keep saying that they pulled out troops years ago. They're still controlling the border. Egypt's border is closed, and it's like shooting fish in a barrel at this point. So I wanted to play something that Israel's economic minister said in an interview with Sky over the weekend when he was asked about the deaths of innocent civilians.
Sometimes, yes, in wars there is collateral damage, but I'm not going to ask forgiveness for defending my 4 children that had rockets shot at my home in Ra'anana this very this morning. Okay. So what Hamas is doing is effectively self-genocide. They're, in a cowardly and cynical fashion, placing their women and children as shields, killing them, and then coming to Sky News and other outlets and saying Israel is killing them.
So, Suho, what he's effectively saying there is that Hamas is committing self-genocide because apparently every woman and child in Gaza is a human shield. On one hand, it's a good thing, I guess, that he's admitting it's genocide. But on the other hand, why do you think this talking point has worked so well to absolve Israel of responsibility every time it kills civilians?
Yeah, I think it's completely ridiculous. I think they're using this human shield thing from the idea that they said that I've seen them put videos of like Hamas telling people not to leave their homes. But I think it's not them using human shield. It's the fact that people don't want to leave their homes. I mean, I know for myself, I can speak. I've been considered being used as a human shield by Hamas because I'm an American here and I'm staying in my house. But no, when I got the phone call, and I got a phone call today from Israel and I refused to answer, telling me that I have to leave my home and I have to evacuate, I say no, I don't want to because this is my home and I'm not going to leave it. And then what Israel does is uses that and says, well, see, Hamas is telling people to stay in their homes. They're using them as human shields. But this is something that's coming to the people. It's their right to stay in their home.
Right, exactly.
And I think the only time I've ever seen human shields being used is by Israeli soldiers when they take over buildings and they keep civilians inside the buildings as they shoot from the top and they snipe other people.
According to Obama and Israeli officials, the ground invasion of Gaza was to, quote, minimize civilian casualties. I mean, considering the rise in the death toll since the invasion, what's your response to that claim?
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, every time there's a ground invasion, I think people in Gaza were, since the beginning of this offensive, Israel has been warning Palestine and warning the world that basically we're going to have a ground invasion. And it was delayed for like an entire week before they actually did it. And that's what Palestinians or people in Gaza fear the most, because ground invasions are known to be much more, even though, of course, missiles are extremely horrific, but ground invasions are much scary because after ground invasion, there's typically an occupation. Gaza is under siege, but with ground invasions comes occupation. There comes extreme fear for soldiers' lives, so a lot of shoot-to-kill policies. So and as we've seen, it's massacres where they just start any sort of movement that they see from any Palestinian walking, it's immediately shoot and kill, just like in Shuja'iyya.
After a heavy bombing of Gaza's power grid, as you just mentioned, you guys have a generator. There's very minimal electricity. I was just reading that the Gaza Strip right now is left with about 2 hours a day. What access do Palestinians currently have to basic resources like water and energy, and what can someone do with just 2 hours of electricity?
There are already places that water has been cut off for good. So a lot of places near the border between Israel and Gaza, a lot of those places, they don't have water. Yesterday, we were trying to get bread, and there were extremely long lines. And one of my brother's friends who works sort of in like importing said that you need to be prepared. Go buy flour, because it looks like we're going to be cut off from a lot of the imports that come into Gaza. And aside from that, electricity, what Israel will do will bomb an electric facility, and then Palestinians have to wait and get an okay from Israel to go and fix it. And sometimes that okay isn't given. That's what happened to me for my area. One of the electric facilities got bombed, and then we had to wait for like 3 days. I didn't have access to internet. I didn't have access to anything until they were able to fix it. So electricity, water, food, there's shortages in everything in the entire city.
And I know John Kerry's heading to Cairo today to negotiate a ceasefire. Talk about Egypt's role in the violence and what people can do here to help Palestinians on the ground in Gaza to end the bloodshed.
Yeah, I think Egypt has been just as complicit as Israel. I see with my own eyes when I look out the window that F-16s are flying into Israeli airspace. I mean, Egyptian airspace as they turn back around to bomb Palestinian homes. Egypt is not even allowing doctors. It's not allowing food. It's closed all its borders. So there's a siege from all sides. Typically, Egypt used to give a little bit air, like during Cast-Led. They were kind of pressured to open the border, and they did do that. But this time around, Sisi has been just as complicit, and I would say in agreement with what Israel is doing. In terms of what people can do, I mean, I studied from the U.S. I just came here like 2 weeks before this all happened. I think it's pressuring our government, calling the White House, calling representatives, and on a more long-term scale, boycotting, divesting, and pushing for BDS and sanctions against the state of Israel until it abides by international law and returns the rights of Palestinians.
Thank you so much for the insight on the ground. Stay safe out there, okay? Suha Najjar, Gaza resident. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, the debate over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so disingenuous in the Western media that simply criticizing the Israeli government earns you the title of an anti-Semite or terrorist sympathizer. But amidst this crass disinformation campaign, a group of Israeli men and women are undermining the staunch Zionist narrative from inside their country, one that perpetuates continued military occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. It's an organization called Breaking the Silence. It's a group of veteran IDF soldiers speaking out about their experiences in the Israeli army and exposing the reality of everyday life in occupied Palestine. Earlier, I was joined by the media spokesperson for Breaking the Silence, Avner Gavaryahu. I first asked him to describe what life is really like in these occupied territories.
I grew up as a religious nationalist Israeli. So I went to a religious high school, and I grew up in an environment that very much urged me to join the army. And I have to say that I did it with a lot of enthusiasm. When I think about what pushed me to Breaking the Silence, it's pretty simple. It was just meeting the reality of occupation. Because even though I saw myself as an intelligent young individual, this reality, which is actually very close to where I grew up in, and very close to every Israeli, because the whole area is pretty small, was something that we never talked about. It was sort of having a backyard that you never visited.
And let's talk about that reality. It says on your website that you hold lectures, house meetings in Israel to, quote, bring to light that reality of life in those occupied territories. What does that life consist of, and what's been the reception from fellow Israelis and the government?
When we talk about an occupation, we talk about it from the bottom up, from the boots on the ground. What it means to control 2.5 million people by force in the West Bank and 1.8 in the Gaza Strip. What does a military occupation look like? And the nature of occupation is very simple. I mean, it's nothing new, it's nothing complicated. When you control people who do not want to be controlled, you have to do it with force. And what I encountered was basically that. Israel has been, doing this for 47 years now, and there's been ups and downs and peaks and lows, and we're in the middle of one of them right now, the operation in Gaza. And I served at the end of the Second Intifada from 2004 to 2007, and basically a lot of what we did was police work, policing the population, controlling the population. But try to imagine a police force that isn't policing civilians, right, that have a say, that have a vote, that have a right to go to their representative and file a complaint against this police, right? There's a system in the West Bank, which is called martial law, which is the military occupation, which basically means the army controls the Palestinians and protects the Israelis. And that's basically what I did. I think entering or invading Gaza is a mistake. I think that even though we're not a group of pacifists, and we definitely recognize Israel's obligation to protect its citizens, I'm one of those citizens, and I deserve my protection. We have to ask, what is the moral price that we're asking, or that we're actually doing, or paying, to be more accurate. And the second thing is the context. We're in 2014. In 2012, there was an operation, Pillar of Defense. 2008, 2009, Defensive Shield, and I can go back. We've been doing this over and over and over again. It's about time, and this is what we try to do tonight, call out to our government and to our society to push for. It's about time to think of a different route. We've been trying to end this horrible and illegal shooting of missiles on civilians in Israel only by force. But we know from our service that using force only brings and only fosters the next generation of hatred. And this is something we know too well from our experiences. But sadly, the red lines that I felt I was crossing as an individual soldier, we're now crossing them as a society, and we're crossing them with the government's orders and with the army's actions.
That was media spokesperson for Breaking the Silence, Avner Gavar-Yahu. Thanks so much for watching, you guys, tonight. Follow me on Twitter at Abby Martin. Join me again tomorrow when I break the set all over again.
Yeah, I take no prisoners, you call it aggressive, but all I see is lies coming out in your message. I keep it audacious, speaking the facts. We break the paradigm with truth and
Welcome to Breaking the Set. I'm Abby Martin. So this past weekend, tens of thousands of activists in countries around the world took to the streets to protest the continued Israeli aggression in the Gaza Strip. In Paris, demonstrators were met with tear gas and rubber bullets as they defied a recent ban on pro-Palestinian protests enacted by the French government. In Chile, 5,000 people surrounded the Israeli embassy and pasted photos of dead Gazan children to its walls. In South Africa, thousands marched in Cape Town and Durban, demanding that the government expel the Israeli ambassador in the wake of the country's grounding in Iraq during the U.S. invasion in 2003. Well, earlier, Darj joined me, and I first asked him to break down exactly what events had taken place since the U.S. withdrawal that have led to Iraq becoming a near-failed state.
It really all started when Maliki took power, because since that time on, he has really been launching an organized, ongoing attack against the minority Sunni population. There's been reports on massive amounts of torture, detainees. Maliki's been sending government forces into primarily Sunni neighborhoods of Baghdad, as well as in towns like Fallujah, to detain Sunnis and holding them in secret prisons. A lot of this has come out.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make it up for it.
And once again, to put something on the air, it's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do, because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is
With so many global conflicts unfolding around the world, the growing unrest in Iraq has largely been backpaged, which could have something to do with the perception that America's involvement in the country is over. Well, in fact, it's still playing a military role in perpetuating the chaos. In fact, more than 5,500 Iraqi civilians have been killed in the first 6 months of this year alone, according to the UN. Additionally, another 1.2 million have been displaced by the violence. So how did it get to this point? This unraveling is the subject of a recent article by journalist Dar Jamal, staff reporter with truthout.org, and one of the very few unembedded journalists to have reported from the ground invasion of Gaza that has left scores of civilians dead. And in the U.S., thousands of activists rallied from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco to condemn the ongoing siege and call for Obama to put an end to the $3+ billion in military aid this country gives Israel every year. So, as we continue to hear the horrific news coming out of Gaza, remember that perhaps nothing is more powerful than a global demonstration of solidarity, because the stronger and louder our voices get, eventually our leaders will have no choice but to listen. Now let's break the set.